Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. As the presentation title gives away, there are lots and lots of ways to fail at security analytics. And in this presentation, I'm going to share some thoughts, frameworks, and ideas on how we can stop that happening by thinking about and managing data like a product. We're going to look at how those frameworks can help us navigate the challenges associated with two critical dependencies in security analytics. The first of which is actually having the data available that we need, and the second of which is being able to move that data to where we need it to go. In my experience, if we don't do this, one of two things is going to happen. Either we are going to fail totally, or we will deliver a level and consistency of value that is unmoving to the people that are paying our salaries. Now, to manage data like a product, we're going to need a crack team that can focus on joining all the dots and picking up all the things that fall between the cracks of any serious effort to use data, to best protect our business. That's likely to be a team of teams. It's not going to be a specific group, and it's going to draw people from all these areas of skill sets to come together to solve the problems we face. And while their mission, in our case, is security specific, as this fantastic paper makes clear, it's actually no different to any other analytics mission that takes place in business today. And that mission can be handily summed up in a single paragraph. It is to facilitate relationships and closely connect all the people that need to come together to collect data, process it, analyze it, and put the results of that analysis to good use. And this isn't just about kind of machine learning and anomaly detection for threaty stuff. This is actually about a bigger issue, which is how different security teams collect and manage their data and then deliver inputs and receive outputs from other teams to make their life easier. So, this is a talk in 4 acts. In the first act, I'm going to describe why security data operations is a necessary function for any security team today. In the second and third act, I'm going to give some ideas about, as I said, some structured approaches to dealing with our critical dependencies for analytics success, namely these ones. And then I'm going to describe the change that security data operations often has to try and bring to a business in terms of the data that security teams have access to and why that is. We're going to go through a lot of material very fast today, so don't try and absorb everything on the slides. Look at this as a field guide for all the issues we're going to run into when we go and do security data operations. And if you want to get access to the slide, they're already pinned on Twitter here, so you can get hold of them with full slide notes and absorb them at your leisure. So for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to CyberCount Systems. You are here because you are afraid. So you should be. Sales of hooded sweatshirts are increasing exponentially, which can mean only one thing. The tide of cybercrime is rising, and while your board are worried, only you know the true meaning of the horror. The complexity of your systems, indescribable. The threats you face, innumerable. The competency of your team, questionable. The challenges you must solve, impossible. Which is why today, I am proud to announce our new product, Anomalooser, because in a world like this, what would want to be different? Anomalooser harnesses the power of very clever math, but not just any math. Math so devious in its power, so complete in its knowledge, that it knows what the threat is and who the threat is at all times, and that threat is Gabe. Gabe is printing documents 2 floors above and hundreds of meters away from his team in a vain effort to hide the fact that he is exfiltrating your intellectual property in physical form. Gabe is your data thief. That threat is Hoff. Hoff's credentials are being used to access systems that deviate from his baseline from a foreign country. Hoff is collaborating with the Russian mafia. Hoff is giving them access to your systems. Hoff is your mole. The threat is Layla. Layla is downloading gigabytes of data to her personal laptop in a manner that is so egregious that all access to her systems must be shut off immediately and automatically. But enough of these trivialities. As our comprehensive demonstration has shown you, there is only one answer to your cybercrime needs. That answer is Anomalusa. That answer is 43. Now, while I cannot promise you our system is 100% accurate, what fool would do that? What I can promise you is if before buying our software you had fear, uncertainty and doubt, when we are done with you, you will have fear, uncertainty, doubt and a massive invoice that we will use to pay for bizarre neoclassical fusion art that will hang on the walls of our West Coast offices so that when you visit us, you are in no doubt about where your money has gone. Now, the only question that remains for you to answer today is, are you ready to buy? Oh. Oh. So, thank you for indulging me in that. That's a condensed version of fairly much every pitch you get in security analytics as you begin to slide down a vendor's sales pipeline. And while yes, I'm sure you'll show me something in 30 days, possibly how difficult it is to get data into your product, there's a really serious point here about the challenges that face businesses that want to use data analytics and automation to improve their business. Oh, thank you. Change mine. I would argue 10 years ago, it was a simpler time. Oh, thanks. Sorry.
Kill that. Oh, I'm killing the guy.
So 10 years ago was a simpler time. Sure, we had salespeople like this pitching us for kind of IDS, firewalls and stuff, but within a year we could know roughly what the tech did and how difficult it was to get us to do it. However, today sales pitches are filled with more confusing terminology like random trees and exponential forests that are somehow kind of automagically going to solve our problems. And while it's very easy to embarrass this new generation of salesperson if you have a maths degree when they spout this kind of stuff in meetings, it's really hard, with or without a maths degree, to really know what kind of value a product can give you in the long term. And that's the case because when you go and speak to peers in the marketplace and they say negative things about analytics solutions, you can probably attribute that just as much to failures of deployment as you can product failures themselves. And that kind of means you've got no option with this stuff but to just give it a try. And that can be really daunting because when you go and speak to people that have committed to a vendor technology and feel they're getting value, this is the kind of thing they say. The product's great, as long as you don't believe the marketing, great. We had to invest 5 years and 2 analysts to build the skills to use it, and if they leave, we're screwed. So, if one of our jobs in security data and operations is to avoid wasting time on POCs that won't deliver value, another one of our jobs is to ensure that if we do commit to something that we think lines up, we know what we're getting into. So it's handy to have a set of questions to do this. Here are mine. My personal favorites are number 5 and number 8. To date, only 3 vendors that I've spoken to have given me what I would consider double thumbs up answers to these without missing a beat, and all of those people were CEOs of their company. So that's Alex Pinto from Niddle, it's Rob Lee from Dragos, and Kelly White from Risk Recon. All great people and all great products that I would definitely recommend checking out if you have the time. Now, as helpful as these questions are, you may well be asking them while you are already in an express elevator to hell going down. And what you find when you get there is the vendor dashboard. Designed, of course, to look amazing. So amazing that in the heat of the moment, one of your team may turn to the vendor and say, sideways to you as well as the skeptic brought into the room to put them through their paces, "You mean this could be our single pane of glass?" To which you will sigh, "But don't we have 5 of those already?" Because if you spend long enough looking at this space, what you find is there are a load of very specific niche use cases that vendors are selling on platforms that restrict both your ability to ask the data further questions that you have to put into these platforms, as well as use the platforms themselves to do what you want. I must say, not all niche solutions are bad. So, Alex from Little Corp's solution is a great example. Very specific data sets, very targeted fields within those data sets. And if you feed that, they can tell you very specifically what value they can give you. But if you're going to a vendor who's tackling a kind of wider problem set, for example, like UEBA, what you can find is there's a massive imbalance in terms of what it takes to get this stuff working, and then the long-term value that you're going to be able to extract from it. And that's especially the case in being able to get data out of these things. Because in some cases, once you've got it in there, you can neither push out what the data the solution needs to process, or the data that it generates, which you then want to enrich and correlate with other sources. And that's really annoying. Now, of course, vendors don't want to tell you this, because if they did, you might stare a year into the future and realize that after investing all this time, what you're going to have is a capability that's limited, and at best, the challenge you now need to solve is on the roadmap, favorite term of any product manager, and you're stuck in an awkward place without a paddle. But yet, this is the dynamic that 90% of the buy side face. And why is that? Well, if you think about it in terms of who develops analytics and who develops platforms, there are actually very, very few companies, very few private sector firms that can afford to develop their own platform and develop analytics on that platform. And if they decide to do that, they have to commit to it for the long term, because there's not really much incentive for a vendor to build analytics on a private sector company's platform, which they get full visibility into, because vendors like to develop intellectual property they can resell. There's also very few firms that can or want to work with unproven startups, which is basically outsourcing both the building of the platform and the doing of the analytics to companies that need but don't have data to develop their IP. Which means that you're probably here. And if you are, what you've got is generally applicable, narrow use cases on a platform that limits your capabilities. Now, side note, I really hate the term use case, because while it is possible to find a use for almost everything, that is not necessarily the problem that you need to solve. However, we must stare into those darkest of mirrors, as it would be wrong of me to suggest the only challenge we face in security data operations is vendors selling us stuff we don't need. If you ever heard a CISO say something like, oh, the dashboard should look like Minority Report, you have a fair idea of the story, which I'm about to tell. The cry goes out, we must have all the data. Teams of data engineers and data scientists are hired. Morale is high. They are sold a vision of extensible platforms, a network of things working together to solve all these teams' problems. But if you fast forward a few years into the future, millions burnt through in budget, teams that funded this central effort asking for their money back, what you find is everyone got a little of what they wanted and no one got enough of what they needed. TLDR, just because you can, does not mean you should. So this brings us neatly to the summary of our first act. Ultimately, in business, we are responsible when we're running programs like this to make the best decision we can in often complicated environments in imperfect conditions. And that means that we're going to have to make trade-offs in terms of what platforms we use. Some are going to be open, some are going to be proprietary, some are going to be things we develop ourselves, some are going to be things we absolutely rely on our vendor partners to deliver. And what that means is that we need to really understand as we go into this to deliver both long-term and short-term value for our businesses from analytics. What does the system of processes look like that's going to make these things work together effectively so that we don't have loads of silos of data that can't talk to each other and loads of people having to look into loads of different panes of glass? This is where security data operations really comes into play. It's about knitting together all these solutions. And it's about focusing on the two critical dependencies that we're going to have regardless pretty much of any technology we choose, which are namely the data features we have available to feed our analytics and how we're going to get that data from where it is at the moment to where it's going to be analyzed. So getting the data is going to be our first key focus in the next act. And then the act after that, we're going to focus on getting the data and talk about pipeline and bandwidth. So, Act 2, let's jump in. If you're a CISO and you want to make an argument for why security need to get their hands on data, a good pitch might be something like this. We need timely visibility into our environment to know if things are working more or less as they should, and obviously to find risks, discover bad stuff, and hey, like data gives us that, so give us the data, please. And if you speak to CIOs and CXOs, they don't disagree. They don't need monthly PowerPoints. They need current data to run their business better. However, as the selective attention test makes clear, just having data, just having visibility is a very far cry from being able to recognize the things we need to, even if they're in plain sight. Alex from Netflix has a fantastic blog on sockless detection, which I'd highly recommend you read, if only for this line. The creation and/or collection of data should be justified by a quantitative reduction in risk to the organization in dollar terms. But that can be difficult to forecast accurately until you have a chance to explore the data. Now, obviously, our pitch to the CIO can't be like, hey, sport, we're in a bit of a catch-22 about all this, so if you could just hand everything over on this list, we'll get back to you about what value it has. Because even handing it over can be incredibly expensive. And neither can we or should we make expertise-based claims about what certain data sources will tell us, NetFlow, DNS. As we may well find, after we've gone to all the expense of centralizing these, that they don't actually tell us what they think. That means to develop a structured and reasoned business case for getting the data that we need to do two things. First of all, we need to answer all the questions that tell us about the inventory of data sources we have to work with both now and in the future. And the second thing we need to do is we need to figure out what the answers to these questions mean for what we're going to be able to recognize. The best thinky framework that I have found to reason through this is the Cyber Defense Matrix, which is the brainchild of Sunil Yu. What it gives us is a way to understand what data is provided by what technologies in relation to the operational entities that our business basically relies on to operate. So users, devices, networks, and data, and so on. And it gives us a way to do that in relation to the key security activity domains of identify, protect, detect, etc. We can do this for specific technologies that we have in our environment to understand what data they are providing us based on how we've configured them. And moving on from that, we can also use the matrix to understand what data we have to execute detections on business-critical assets using the data we have today versus the data that we might actually need if we wanted to deliver that detection properly. So here's an example of how to do that. Let's say we've done some appropriate threat modeling and decided that we want to detect super users who are trying to exfiltrate our intellectual property. We can use the cyber defense matrix to say, right, well, what are the data sources that we'd need in order to do that? So we'd obviously need to identify the users. We might need to identify the accounts they use. We might reasonably want to know what devices they use when they su or sudo in to a server. We may well want to know if we have a privileged access management solution in place. What was the reason that someone checked out privileged access, and does that correspond to the logs we're seeing on the device that they're logging into? That means that we'll need logs from servers and devices they log into, potentially applications. And we might want to see if there are any network sources showing us movement of data from A to B. Once we've gone through that kind of exercise, we can then zero in on the priority data sources. Let's say we decide that those are PowerShell logs and web proxy data. What we can do now is we can, for those data sources, start to map our capabilities to make use of them, starting with our dependency tree here, and I've gone with a sliding scale of we have no capability, weak capability, good, or optimized down the bottom. I'm not sure if you can see that at the back, but that's what the bottom scale is. So let's take an example. Let's say we do this for web proxy data. For tech, we've bought great tech. We've gone top right-hand quadrant. We've got the best. Unfortunately, we've configured it really badly, or not at all. So config-wise, we're going to need some work. We do have a data pipeline. That's great. But unfortunately, we don't have much bandwidth in that pipeline, so we can't shift the logs at speed. We're going to have to batch them. We're not sure what that means for the SLA on the detection that we're going to be running. We've got a great platform to put them in. We can ETL them, no problem. But even if we do that, there's some weak team processes in terms of the capability to get these logs. And while there are some skills, we're going to have to train people up to understand the data and the alerts in our SOC. So it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly when you do this what you're going to need to shift to the right. And this is where we're going to have to focus to understand what kind of effort and money is going to be involved in this and what kind of change in our business processes might be involved and who are the teams who are going to help us. Side note, we can also ask what happens if a technology gets swapped out or disappears. So if the web proxy solution that you're using is going to be replaced with another, will you get the same fidelity out of data that you did with the previous one? And if not, what does that mean for what you're going to be able to detect in the data that you can get from it? So if you do this for all your detection goals, and then you do it for all the data sources that are relevant to those detection goals, which sounds like a lot of work, what you get is a cross-referenced set of your minimum viable data sets that you're going to need to deliver the detections that you have decided to prioritize based on threat model and risk model. So here's an example of what a roadmap might look like once you've gone through this. Now, this isn't necessarily right, but it's just to show how you can begin to pull this journey of acquiring data sets into showing business and showing other teams the kind of logic and the kind of progression we're going through and why we're asking them to ultimately give us the data and go through the effort of pulling it out of their systems and putting it into somewhere else. It also helps us show the business, who often kind of want to get straight to Lego techniques. They're like, yeah, we want this super advanced thing. It's like, I think we need to start at Duplo. I think we need to start somewhere a little bit simpler, then we'll build up to Lego, and then maybe we'll get to Lego techniques. But it allows us to show the business that we're on a path to laying down those fundamental building blocks for the capabilities thereafter. If we're lucky enough not to have a flat network, we can also segment this by different environments. And what that does is further de-risk the type of data that we're going to be looking at and hopefully helps us focus in on more specific detections on particular choke points in our business. So, good news. We have now got our business case for the data that we want. We've got our roadmap for the data we want. And it's time to go get that data. Any serious effort to centralize security logs is going to run into the challenge of bandwidth. And more specifically than just bandwidth, the headroom that is available within your existing bandwidth. And that is because when your business put down the pipes that it thought it needed to shift data from A to B, large amounts of security logs were probably not on the top of the laundry list. This means when the cry goes out to have the data, different teams will hear this message in different ways. Your networks team, for example, may feel that this is a risk to their SLAs. So you're very quickly going to run into a bunch of constraints. And that means you're going to have to make a lot of decisions around those constraints about what data is stored where, for how long, what is moved where, for how long, and what eventually gets to your end state platform. Those decisions are going to have to be made across what I call the 3 pillars of getting the data: hosts and observers that generate it, intermediaries, collection points, which you may have to use before you send it on to the platform where your analysis is running. The decisions you're going to make are more or less are going to break down like this. And the reason that these decisions become important is as you begin to filter data out as it gets to your platform, you have less rich content available to you, for example, in the event of needing it for an investigation. And as Charity Majors says in this wonderful comment, if you don't follow Charity, well worth following on Twitter, loads and loads of insights. You might end up with a situation where not only is the data you have not what you need, but all context has been stripped away when you go and look for that narrative in the data about what's happened in that incident. And so that becomes really important when you start thinking about local storage, what's available and what you're going to mandate or put in policy or request for those teams that are running these devices that are generating the data. Now, it'd be lovely if you just had like 1 or 2 types of collectors, 1 or 2 types of hosts, but the reality is you're going to have loads. And not only are you going to have loads, you're going to have them across loads of different environments. Some are going to be in multiple on-prem data centers, all of which are structured differently. Some are going to be in the cloud. Some are going to be in the hybrid cloud, which no one can really explain, and it rather sounds like someone's just a third party managing a data center for you. And then some will be in an environment that everyone's like, just stay away from there until the transformation is complete. Because it's a very politically charged environment, and doing anything in that would be really bad. So what we end up with when we go through these decisions is more like a capability that's a multi-headed squid with tentacles reaching into lots of data, as opposed to having the power of one ring to rule them all. And what that means is we need to break down the problem. And we need to do this for 3 reasons. First of all, we need to understand the complexity we're dealing with, which is what I call kind of finding out where the bodies are buried and why certain teams are kind of repaving their patio every 3 weeks. The second is, what is the second? Hopefully I haven't got my notes here. All right, we won't bother with the second. And the third is figuring out what the system of processes is that you're going to have to use once you join this stuff together. So, when we go do this, we're going to run into a bunch of teams that we need to go and ask for help. And to do that, it really helps to have thought through all the issues that those teams are going to face, because we're going to run into stakeholders that may, for some reason or other, be unsupportive of our efforts. And we need to be able to show them that we're doing as much work as we can for them to make their lives easier, rather than giving them a huge list of things to do and a huge load of problems that we want them to go and figure out. It also does help on occasion to make sure that you have much better questions than people you go speak to, so you can just get rid of them, get them out of your way. So what we're going to do now is run through the key dimensions that we need to think about for hosts and observers, for collectors, and for platforms. And then we're going to get into the final act of our presentation. So let's dive in. Host first. 5 things to really consider here. Number 1, the mechanism of the logging that you're asking for. Key point here, it's really important. When we go and ask for data, we're really specific about what we're looking for. And the reason for that is if we say, hey, we want Windows logs, we could be talking about native Windows logs. We could be talking about antivirus alerts from agents installed on Windows servers. We could be talking about the function that Windows servers provide, like DHCP servers. And if we're not super clear, and if we don't have a good way of structuring that, not only will teams not be entirely sure what we're asking for, but we will have no way to track over time what we've asked for and what we're getting across all these different environments. So we need a matrix of some sort to do that. Volume. We're not going to be able to send data anywhere until we've worked out what kind of volumes we're talking about. Here is a handy calculation to be able to figure that out. But the key thing we're going to have to work on with these teams that we work with is what is the time period of interest that we want to calculate volume for? Now, it may well be kind of something general, like, hey, we want to know over 7 days for each hour during those 7 days how much this firewall produced by way of log volume. Or it might be based on a constraint that we're going to run into. For example, how long a particular server can store a certain amount of logs before we have to write and batch it off to get to our platform. We might also be further downstream. We might be worried about how contended our collection server is going to be from all these hosts and observers at the 95th percentile when they're bombarding our collection server with logs. Side note, extrapolation can be difficult. Different types of devices, even of the same type, produce different data and perhaps do that inconsistently. So it's very easy to get this wrong. Don't do that. It's also important in terms of how much data you think your collector is going to be processing, because if the team that hosts it puts it in an environment where it can't scale or can't actually deal with true volume of the logs you're collecting, you're up a difficult creek without a paddle. And side note, there are actually lots of time periods to consider. For example, at the moment from data being generated that indicates something bad to it getting to the SOC to deliver an alert or an automated message to someone, they all need consideration, and that takes a lot of time to think through. Collection mode. We can push-pull, directly from, indirectly from. The key point here is sometimes you're going to be able to send logs directly to your collection and server and platform from the place they were generated. Sometimes you're going to be dealing with an intermediary decentralized collection point. And that, depending on the nature of your infrastructure, can impact where you have to put your collectors to be able to move them to where your central platform is hosted, be that in the cloud or on-prem. That needs thought, and it also needs understanding of what the traffic routes for all these different data volumes will look like. You also need to figure out what's being collected where, so if that feed stops, you know what went wrong where in your collection infrastructure. Format. There are lots of them. The key thing here is understanding what your system of analytics is going to have to process or transform by way of different formats so that they become consumable and usable by the analytics you're running in the back end. And finally, capacity. Capacity is really important because if, as you will, you decide at some point to turn the logs up to 11, you need to make sure that you can do that on the bits of kit on which your, for example, domain controllers have been built without melting the CPU and memory. Collector dimensions. 5 things to think about here too. Now, we've already talked a lot about store and forward fidelity, so we don't need to go over this in too much depth, except to say that if at the point of collector you decide to filter data out, keep track of what you've filtered out so you know what you can filter back in later if you need to. Forwarding agents. The choice of this may be made already for you depending on the platform you've decided to use. But the key thing here is just to understand, will the collector that you're using be able to handle the volume of logs that you want to throw at it in the long term, or not? Can it drink from the fire hose? Spec. Again, with your collectors, if you turn logs up to 11, they've got to be able to handle that. Here's a simple way to figure out if your collector is going to be able to handle the volumes of data that you're throwing at it. Pick a top talking host, turn on all the logs. Tweak the EPS input to the collector via config. Figure out where the CPU, the memory, the net, the disk IOPS collapses. At fail, increase what's required, and then test and retest. The bonus with this is if you've already got your forwarder installed, you can test what kind of compression and what forwarding rate you're getting on those logs as well, which is a double bonus. Then you just rinse, repeat, keep going. Resilience. I'm not going to cover this other than to say this is when it's really handy to have an awesome enterprise architect on your team who really understands how to build resilient or high availability infrastructure. And then throttling. Now, it may be that you're not able to send all the logs to the place you want at the time you want them. And that might mean that you have to batch. Now, batch has great advantages to compression in terms of the volume of data that you're dealing with. But that may also affect the SLA that we can give on our analytics. It may be fine that an analytic runs once every 24 hours, but then again, there might be other analytics where the SLA is more like matters of minutes, like 15 minutes, the business would definitely want to know if that thing happened. If you're streaming, it's really important that you understand who has their hand on the lever of what logs are moving where, and if for any reason they need to shut that off, who gets notified if they do, and what's the plan in order to then shift those logs to the central place that you want them so that you can catch up on the amount of logs you want. And that's also the case on failover. So if your network is highly constrained and there's a failure during one of the few times that you can shift logs during the day, can you ever catch up before those logs get written to cold storage, overwritten, or deleted? Platform dimensions. So I'm not going to dwell too much on platforms because there's a lot to say, and frankly, what you'll find is that people have very strong opinions about platforms. And those opinions are not always the same. So suffice to say, one of the reasons that people don't like certain commercial platforms is the pricing model. It's deemed very expensive. And this is a great thread. Every Splunk install I've seen has utilized some method, usually syslog-ng, in front of the data collectors to throttle prune the logs, defeats the whole point of log archaeology. But as an alternative answer to this thread makes clear, these problems are agnostic of platforms. I mean, don't kid yourself. If you're going to do this properly, it doesn't matter whether you Elk, Hadoop, Sumo, Splunk, it's going to be expensive. You're going to have to pay the piper somewhere. And as this gentleman says, these blind spots exist with lots of solutions, not just with Splunk. Buyers often forget to plan budget for a lot of direct or indirect costs, especially fully tuned deployment, 100%. Right, we've covered a lot of ground. We've gone quite quickly. I appreciate this is the morning, first track of the day. It's maybe been a bit rushed. It's all right. We're just going to recap, reset, and then we're going to get into our last act. So we've talked about the need for a team to manage data like a product, and the need for them to do that management across all the dimensions that are going to contribute to what value we're getting of making our data available to ask it questions. We've talked about the fact that the first of those challenges is going to be identifying and prioritizing what kind of data we want and developing a good business case for that. We talked about the second issue of then actually getting that data and having to make trade-offs and decisions of what we move where and what's stored for how long. We've talked about the way that we can do that using the cyber defense framework to talk through the different data sets we need and prioritize them. And we've also come up with a way to look at the dependencies that might prevent us reaching our goal and help us uncover the places that we're going to have to spend money if we want to make the shift to the right that's going to be needed, potentially to deliver lots and lots of different benefits through analytics, not only to security, but to other parts of the business as well. We've come up with our roadmap, which we now have. We can show to other parts of the business. We know what we're going after. We've come up with an understanding across our different environments of what this is going to mean for our different collection pillars. We've thought through all the angles, and we're ready for any objections we might face. So I want to finish the presentation with kind of a view on why does all this matter? To detect functions especially, but also to wider security teams. Because if you go and ask the majority of firms today what drives data collection, the likelihood is what they're going to tell you is compliance or whatever came out of the box. And if you've ever looked inside the cold, dark heart of the data pipeline to your SIM platform, you, like many others, will have found it to be wanting. So not many organizations, in my experience, go to the SOC, to incident response, and say, what is the user need that you have? And what system of processes does that user need exist in today? And what change would you like to bring? Because in my experience, they don't say, I need another 50,000 alerts with no idea what systems those alerts are relevant to and no ability to triage them other than via loads of work. What they say is, I'd like to be able to search when I want. So what is the status quo that has led to the situation that we find ourselves in as security teams trying to use data to make our lives better? So to explain this, I'd like to imagine that these buckets represent all potential data that we could have across various different types: security technology, internetworking, devices like servers and workstations, apps, and various enrichment data. Obviously, we're going to have different types of data that all these things are generating. And within those buckets, we're only going to be generating a percentage from 0 to 100% of everything that we might want to generate that we could get our hands on. There might be some blips in that. So for example, maybe someone's doing some ops troubleshooting and Bob has a syslog server under his desk where he pulls data occasionally for his troubleshooting needs, but generally it's going to be fairly static. Though let's not forget about that server. It gets important later on. So there are a couple of implications of this. First of all, there's a ton of lost potential of what we could be generating that's security relevant. And second of all, we absolutely know that we're not going to be centralizing all of it. So if we look at what that picture is over time in aggregate, if we poured all those buckets together, it would look roughly like this. Some lost potential, loads of stuff that's not centralized, some stuff of questionable value that is centralized, and a few blips here and there for ops dip tests. So let's narrow in on what we are collecting. Let's look at a time period of the last 90 days. We're going to probably have some assumptions about what's definitely available either locally or in a centralized collection point, or where logs only might be available. It gets a little more blurry. And then it happens. The incident, the moment of boom. And now we will have to ask questions of the logs that we have available. Because it's time to forensicate. The experts have been called in. They know the data sources that have potential signals that we might need to look at in order to determine what the adversary did and where they went. Now, those signals aren't necessarily going to be relevant, but those are the data sets that we're going to need to go and get at short notice to figure out if they are. This is where, horror of horrors, we discover we're not even collecting locally for 30 days. Because during an incident a few months ago during troubleshooting, someone turned off log collection, and because there was no policy that said it had to be turned on, they just never reactivated it, and no one picked up on that until the moment of boom. But we can check our SIM, right? So we run to the SIM. What we find is that unfortunately the SIM only keeps data directly associated with alerts for 90 days. All other data is stripped away at the intermediary decentralized collection points before it's sent to be processed. So there's no time for sad face here, because now is the time for prayer. Do those logs exist anywhere else? Our prayers are answered by Bob. Someone finds out about his syslog server, and indeed, there is the data that we need. Thank you, Bob. We won't let this happen again. We've learned our lesson. We're going to roll this data source into our SIM so that next time we get the alerts. Except we won't. Because what stings us this time is probably, on the basis of Sod's law, not going to be what stings us next time. And even if it is, it's not going to be in the same place with the data that Bob happened to be collecting. It's going to be somewhere else in our infrastructure. This is what is perpetuating for many security teams the cycle of boom, rinse, and repeat. So if you've invested in a hunt team and you're wondering why your hunt team is failing to deliver on this amazing vision statement that sounds super exciting, then look no further than what you've got. Side note, this is also why any vendor that suggests this abomination in terms of running analytics to help you detect stuff should be instantly cast out of your office, never to return. So I think in security data operations, we need to adopt a philosophy a la Jim Collins that shoots for the stars. And our starting point should be collect everything that we reasonably need by default. Figure out what that data can tell us about the narratives that we need to know about from the point of view of the threats and risks in our business, and then filter and exclude by exception. Because how can we know if a field in a data source is relevant if we've never enabled it and never collected it. So let's look at what justifies this. So why have I come to this conclusion? Well, ultimately, in security, we need better correlation of nuggets. That's what we're after. And sure, as Craig Chamberlain makes the point here, there are going to be some things, some high-fidelity alerts that we can get with just one data source, and we should absolutely grab those with both hands. However, deciding to try and dial down data collection is the right answer to the wrong problem. Because what we need in order to develop better alerts that give us better activity from our SOC is actually more data, not less, because that's how we're going to be able to tune our understanding of our environment over time, and as Craig says, devise intelligent alerts. And that becomes clear when we look at the ways that we need to comprehend data in relation to what it can tell us about threat activity. So sequences, fairly obviously, before we heard the boom of the thunder, we could have seen the strike of lightning. It's really challenging to do that if the logs are only collected in a decentralized way, because what that means is lower downstream, when you see things that aren't high fidelity alerts, they'll probably be either not got to, because there's 50,000 alerts that people are trying to get to, or they will just be categorized as, oh, well, that doesn't look that threatening, doesn't look that bad, it's probably a false positive. Structure. Sometimes sequence isn't enough. Sometimes, even with a sequence, we can't for sure say that's malicious as opposed to just suspicious or benign. And so we're going to need to dive into the structure of a thing that was alerted on, and we're going to be able to have to make sure that data hasn't been deleted in the time that we want to kind of grab it and look at it. And finally, sets. Because if we think about different data sets at more or less the same kind of timestamp and how we may see indicators of threat activity, in certain instances, in different data sets, we're going to see exactly the same signal at what is effectively the same time. And that gives us a great point on which to triage. But for other things, we're only going to see it in one data source. That's the only place it's going to show up. And in other places, at the same time, we may see different signals of activity. So we really need to be able to pull all that together through this method of collect everything that we need by default, understand what threat activity looks like across that data, and then filter, exclude by exception. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that we discard at risk that which didn't seem relevant at the time in isolation, and later on turns out to be absolutely vital. So with that, thank you very much. To the punchline of the talk, go manage data like a product. I think we need to focus more on the data that technology gives us as opposed to the technologies and the use cases that we're being sold. The science and the frameworks to do this now exist. So with things like MITRE ATT&CK, we can now really begin to categorize what we can protect, what we can detect across vectors and exploits, and really understand what we're able to do from the point of view of fast response to either new techniques in vectors that we're monitoring or not monitoring, and new exploits that come out. This isn't just about ML. This is about how the whole security team uses data. You'll be super surprised when you go and do this in your business, as I have for the last 7 months, all the other teams that come out of the woodwork and go like, at last, someone who's looking at this, because we really want that data too, and we want to help you do this. And it's amazing how you find loads of people are struggling with the same issues as we are in security about the quality of data that we have. So if there is a battle cry, go do this. Go start a security data operations group in your business. Go bring people together across these disciplines and figure out how we can all improve our lives. So a big thank you to all the people that have helped me with this talk and contributed to the ideas over the last few years. And thanks to you for listening. If there's one, message that I can leave you with, keep calm. Make the world a better place, and if you'd like to talk about how to do that with data, I always love to chat about this stuff, so thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
All right, thank you very much, John. That was wonderful. Any questions, anything anybody would like to cover? We'll bring you a mic. Your hands up first.
Thank you, John. That was a very excellent talk. One question. At the end, you mentioned security data operations. Why do you think this is a function of security and not a function of IT in general?
That's a great question. I think it should be a function of IT, and if you look at what companies are trying to do as they shift, so in big companies, the shift that I see is people are trying to move from old things being done in old ways to new things being done in new ways, which is typically called digital, which is about changing the way that data flows between various systems and having a better understanding of that. IT has been stuck in a lot of firms being IT management, and they've been severely constrained with very little budget, very little support, and so often when you come in, there isn't the drive to do that in IT. So when you do get the opportunity to come in and deliver that kind of transformation, doing it through security and showing people that this isn't just about analytics, this is about how we use data, is a great way to do it. And yeah, maybe one day it will be in IT, and in some firms it probably is already. I just haven't seen that in the majority of ways, so this is kind of the hack to do that, and by getting other people on board with it, it tends to work. At least in my experience, that's what I found.
I think the biggest thing I've noticed when it comes to collecting all the data is PII questions. When I was a developer, not in security, but we would always have to have everything filtered out. So, a lot of that data is just lost intentionally. Particularly with the GDPR coming up too, is like, no, we don't want to keep that data because that's a toxic waste dump for us. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. So actually, in one of the in that slide of the team of teams, legal, super important stakeholder. You can get access to that data, you can process it, you just need a good justification for why you're doing that and what the risk to the business is. And if you have those conversations and you're very open about it, usually you can get to a good negotiation point. And then in terms of how you then go on to protect that data in wherever you're storing it. So I found that can be done despite the regulatory requirements, as long as that's explained in terms of risk, not in terms of like, security really bad stuff might happen and like loads of fear mongering. So that's been my experience at any rate. But I'd be keen to understand from anyone else, what they've run into if they've run into other problems. But I haven't, so I can't really talk to it. That's how I got around it anyway. Go and take legal for a coffee is one of the first things you do, and make super good friends with them.
Can you go back to your slide reference for the slides, the Twitter one?
Yes, I may be sometime. Was that the Splunk one?
I think it's the one that's the last one. It's the last one. The one you were just on? Yeah, with the list of...
For your slides. Oh, your
Oh, right. CXO Sidekick on Twitter. So if you search for that, CXO Sidekick, then you'll find me, and the slides are pinned right at the top. Sorry, I can... there we are. That's an easy way to do it. Yeah, like comments are on as well on that deck. Sorry, it's not coming up. Now I've broken it. There we are. So yeah, comments are open. This is hosted on Dropbox. So if you've got like things you'd like to contribute, ideas, critiques of the things I've written, things you think could be improved, like just dump the comments in there. Try not to be rude, or I'll have to shut them off. But if you do, if you find this useful, if you'd like to collaborate around it, that was part of the point of doing the talk, was to kind of press print on a load of things that I wish I'd had as ways to think about this problem. So hopefully that's helpful. But if there's anything wrong or that you disagree with, I'd super like to know about it. Cool, that looks like it. To lunch. Oh no, one more.
Notice I think it was between Act 1 and Act 2, you had almost a pretty in-depth, kind of like a vendor survey is what I would call it, questions. However, is that like a second tier? Because I think that, I understand the in-depth of doing it, but do you have like a secondary one, like some of your top 5 that you asked, so they even get to that vendor list? I assume that's what it was. It looked like something that you were like a vendor.
So this is the questions, right?
Yes.
So the point of these is what with these, what I found is, first of all, you need to figure out if you're speaking to a vendor that wants to partner with you, or is in just scale up, sell to anyone we can, damn the consequences, and like if we get lucky, maybe we get to flog you some professional services to deal with like the horrendous install that will go horribly wrong because you can't get access to the data. That's kind of like one way to filter these out, because you get really bad answers to these, or they give non-answers. Good vendors will either give you a really crisp answer to them that's like, hey, if you don't have this, this, and this, don't bother doing business with us because we won't be able to give you any help. Other vendors will go, I can't answer that question, but let me put you in front of our chief data scientist and they will answer those questions. And if they do that, that's another good sign. So this is kind of a proxy for figuring out how much do these people want to help us? Because you will need help with this if you're just buying a product and you don't have a team like the one I run, which is whose job it is to go and make this stuff work, go and reach out to all the different teams who need to get the data. For UEBA is like a classic example, right? There's a lot of stuff you've got to get in there, and if it's not just going to be security who own the data, it's going to be like 5 or 6 teams. So that's kind of the intent with the questions. Does that answer what you were asking?
I would say more of, do you have like maybe 1 or 2, maybe top 5 questions you asked?
Those two.
Before they even
that's
get
it.
to this thing, like what you said, like what would you say to a vendor, like the top 3 things that you would say before you would even do this to figure out the partnership there?
So what attack techniques and what attack surfaces do you cover? If they can't very concisely articulate that, game over. The specific data sources, if you can't tell me exactly what you need and the fields in those sources, then you're just asking for loads of data and we're hoping we're going to tune it later, to my mind anyway. And then the next one about the visibility of the logic. If I can't understand how you've built your machine learning, like how do I know what it was trained on and that there wasn't either bad stuff or wrong stuff on the training model, if I can't get insight into that, I'm basically buying a black box. And I don't want to try and detect badness through a black box because I can't understand how the thing works. So those 3 are, to my mind, like pretty much if they're not willing to give you very frank, honest answers about that, then the flag goes up. So yeah, that's the answer to that. I'm losing my voice.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.